Welcome to Story Chat Radio. We are book editors Carly Hayward and Jenny Chappell. Every month we watch a different movie with an eye for storytelling and novel writing.
We use our years of training and experience editing novels to break down each movie's storytelling elements to help you improve your novel in progress.
Warning, Jenny ruins everything.
Hey, you ruin things too.
So don't be surprised if there are spoilers.
On this episode, we are discussing the science fiction, romantic comedy drama, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. And then we'll end with a critique of one lucky author's query. And just as a reminder, you can now support the podcast on Patreon, where you can read the queries we critique, plus get lots of other bonus content. It's easy to find. Just go to patreon.com/storychatradio.
All right, here come the spoilers. Joel Barish is an emotionally withdrawn man, and Clementine Krasinski is his girlfriend who is a dysfunctional free spirit. They are inexplicably attracted to each other despite their different personalities. They do not realize it, but they are former lovers, now separated after 2 years together. After a nasty fight, Clementine has had her memories of their relationship erased from her mind. Upon learning this, Joel is devastated and goes to the doctor to have the same procedure done. However, while unconscious, Joel has second thoughts and decides he wants to keep his memories of Clementine. Much of the film takes place in Joel's brain as he tries to find a way to preserve his memories of Clementine, and two techies try to erase his memories. We watch their love and courtship go in reverse. The memories are slowly erased while Joel tries his best to resist the procedure and hide inside his mind. In separate and related story arcs, the employees of the corporation are revealed to be more than peripheral characters in scenes, which further show the harm caused by the memory-altering procedure. Mary has had an affair with the married head of the company and agreed to have the affair erased from her memory when his wife discovered the relationship. Patrick becomes fixated on Clementine and uses Joel's personal mementos that he gave the company as part of the procedure in order to seduce her. These romantic entanglements turn out to have a critical effect on the main storyline of the relationship between Joel and Clementine, so everything is very interconnected. Mary ends up stealing the company's records and sends them to all of its clients. Thus, Joel and Clementine both get to listen to their initial tape recordings and afterwards realize that even if everything in life isn't perfect, their relationship could still be worthwhile. So, Jenny, what do you think of this movie?
I like the vast understatement of everything is very interconnected here.
I know, me too.
Like,
it's great.
Way to really underplay the importance of that.
Undersell that.
Yeah. It was, the writing in this is complex, to say the least. Mm-hmm. I really did like this movie, but I really did end up liking it. I have a thing about Jim Carrey because he can be so over the top, but because this movie is much more low-key in tone than, say, The Grinch, I actually really enjoyed his performance. And this is really my kind of science fiction. It focuses on the human condition and asks questions that people have really been thinking about for a very long time, only within the context of this speculative technology, because really, who doesn't have some memories they'd like to forget, right? Mm-hmm. It really invites the viewer to consider their own relationship to memory and how much of our personalities are formed by our experiences. It kind of goes both the good and the bad. So longtime listeners know that I don't always love a flashback, but in this movie, they're essential, really, and handled so well, because we only see how all the pieces fit together as we see all the memories and how those have created the current timeline of the film. And then all the side characters are fabulous. Elijah Wood is always somehow equally adorable and creepy. Like, I don't think I'm the only one who feels this way. Maybe
I feel like he's just creepy, but that's my own personal thing.
He's got those, like, big blue doe eyes, you know?
Yeah, they just irritate me. We've had this conversation. I'm just like, I get it. You're supposed to be cute.
So anyway, he has that vibe in this as well.
He does.
And then lastly, the blending of genres is handled really well in this. So it has romance, it has sci-fi, it has humor, but it's also really heartbreaking, and it's all rolled up into this one story. And it's not like there's only this one part that's like that, you know, like it's all very woven together. Really so intricately that you couldn't take one strand out and still have this story. So to sum up, I loved it, even though I didn't have high expectations going in. What did you think?
I love this movie. I saw it back in high school when it first came out, and I watched it quite a few times. This was like teenager Carly was like all about Clementine and her whole like manic pixie dream girl vibes. Which she does try to combat. Like some of her character does seem to be pointed of like, no, I am not your pixie dream girl. I'm a person.
Yeah.
But also at the same time, she kind of holds up that ideal.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah.
I'm not conveying this super well.
No, I think you are. Teenage Jenny was very like that too. Somehow like fighting the stereotype while also being the stereotype.
Yeah, like trying to be it but fight it. I don't know.
Yeah, I feel you.
Basically, it all comes down to is I loved her hair. So, but anyway, rewatching it so many years later, it really holds up. I was a little worried that I'd be like, oh, this is like angsty teen Carly. But it was still really good, and the way they put it all together is really clever. I loved like how the setting in the background slowly begins to go blank, like very slowly, that you don't necessarily notice until a lot of it's gone. And that just reflects like his memories being erased and such. The acting is amazing. I love Kate Winslet though. Like she's so good. And I actually really do love Jim Carrey when he's in like his serious roles. I think he's one of the comedian actors that can like pull that off really well. But yeah, I don't know. It spoke to my angsty teen self. It speaks to my current like angsty self. Also, Clementine's whole wardrobe is somehow back in style. So there's that.
It's true.
No, I love this movie. I loved it. It has a kind of a twist, but it's just clever. It makes me feel clever for following it, even though I'm sure everyone can follow it. It's really good writing, basically. Yeah. Anyway, so Jenny, what is something this movie does well that writers can use in their own work?
Genre mashups.
Wait.
I think we've already done that one, dang it.
Oh man, we should have saved it.
I know. What were we thinking? I hated that other movie too. I will be discussing my hatred of that movie forever now. The one movie we watched that I didn't like. So I think what's really remarkable about this movie is because so much of it is dependent on memory, it really creates these unreliable narrators. And unreliable narrators can be really hard to do successfully because you need the reader or the viewer to still buy into the story. They have to like and trust the narrator, or it can really pull them out of the story. Maybe not even like, but at least be able to relate to and feel engaged with. But when they're done really well, it can really create this interesting perspective for the reader or the viewer. I think a lot of that comes down to, as we often discuss, knowing and subverting the expectations of your reader or your audience. Readers expect narrators to be reliable. You know, we think what we read is going to be the truth, at least as much as the narrator knows it. So it always creates this little surprise when we realize that the narrator isn't reliable. Which can be at varying times in the story with an unreliable narrator. Sometimes we know it at the very beginning. Sometimes we learn it part of the way through. Sometimes we don't learn it until the very end. So it really just depends on how the writer wants to use that information to create tension. It has me thinking some of the other films that I've really loved with unreliable narrators right now, and it's making me want to watch all of them and talk about them on the podcast. Like Memento is amazing. I think that might be my favorite unreliable narrator story. Again, it really plays with memory. The Sixth Sense, which I know like now it's like super cliche or whatever, but it still handles unreliable narrators really well.
That movie still gives me nightmares. We're not watching that movie. I'm just
Gone
saying
Girl,
that right
Gone
now.
Girl. Have you read that?
Okay. Yeah.
Both the movie and the book have that
Both
unreliable narrator, and it's fabulous. Big Fish is another one
I love
that has that
movie.
sort of fabulism feel to it that's really great. I could go on. I won't. But it's just such a delightful experience when you think you know something, and then the story takes this turn you're not expecting, and all of a sudden you realize you have no idea what's going to happen. So when that's done really well, it can really suck a reader or a viewer in. And I think this movie does it really well. So, I mean, really, to me, truly, it's never clear entirely what is fact and what isn't in this.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So let's define what a reliable narrator is versus an unreliable narrator. What's kind of the difference? So to me, it kind of comes down to trust and neutrality. A reliable narrator can be depended on to portray the story accurately and quote-unquote truthfully, whereas an unreliable narrator presents a skewed version of the story. That version can be true to them or not, but isn't necessarily objectively true. Mm-hmm. So like as that saying goes, there are 3 sides to every story. Although it might be 3 sides to every argument. I think it's probably argument, but it works for this too. So there's your version, my version, and the truth.
I'm assuming that is like Carly's version, Jenny's version, and the truth. Like very specifically mine and yours, not just any 2 people.
I mean, it's really Carly's version, Jenny's version, and the truth,
Carly's
AKA
version.
Carly's version. Yeah,
you
knew where it was going. Yeah, exactly. So what is true is up for debate, because my version isn't any less true than yours or Jenny's. But I'm going to kind of steer away from this philosophical debate because that's not the point. And let's talk about books and writing and how it relates to story, I guess, because that's what we do.
It's supposed to be anyway. I'm not sure how successful we are at that.
I don't know. We could just do a philosophical debate and then also discuss movies that, or just list movies for people to watch, like Big Fish.
I think that's a good idea. Let's do that.
Let's do that. Yeah.
Movies.
Okay. So disregarding all of that, a reliable narrator can be depended upon to relay the events to the reader as accurately as possible. But an unreliable narrator can hold information back. They can skew events to make them look more favorable. They can play with a reader's expectations and assumptions. So when everything that you've been reading is suddenly cast in a new light with new information or a new perspective, that's kind of how you know you've been reading a story from an unreliable narrator. So that can be a big reveal of information or truth or insight. It can make for a really compelling, unreliable narrator twist. Mm-hmm. Most of the time, we're kind of used to being able to trust the POV that we're in. As a reader, you trust that the journey they're on is kind of what happened. But when you upend that and give them new information that makes them reevaluate all that they've read, you can kind of hook readers in a really new and fun way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I think all of that is, I don't think I have anything to add to that. My version is your version.
Oh my God. So there's really just one version, and it's Carly's version.
I don't like the direction this went. This is why I don't admit to agreeing with you very often. So really, I think what makes this movie so remarkable is the way that memories are used. I think it's really the strongest tool the filmmakers had to create this unreliable narrator. Like, memories are all 100% subjective.
Yep.
My husband is a total true crime junkie and watches, like, every murder show, every cult show he can find. And one thing that's always clear is that not everyone remembers events the same way. And I
Yeah.
think we've probably all experienced situations where we remember something very differently from the way others involved remember it. That can be a huge source of conflict in real life. And of course, that's the best kind of conflict for stories, is stuff that's good conflict in real life as well. So the very premise of this movie really draws on that concept. We see these two characters who remember things very differently. But what's even more interesting is that it creates this whole other layer of, like, the truth by showing us Joel watching his memories. It allows him to get a different perspective on them. I'm kind of tempted to say it's more objective, but I think it's maybe just a different kind of subjective. He's still
Yeah.
processing it
Interesting.
all. Yeah, he's still processing it from this place of his own experiences. So even though he sees them in a new way now, it's still subjective. It also creates this really intimate, personal experience for the viewer. We've talked before, I think, about how deep point of view creates that sort of intimate experience for your reader. But I feel like this goes beyond deep point of view into, like, something else altogether. Like, it's like the fourth dimension of point of view or something. Like, we see Joel reflecting on his own thoughts. So normally in a deep point of view, we see thoughts as they come up. And of course, there's some reflection. But this is like a whole other level. This is like some transcendental stuff. And I think because of that reflection, it invites the viewer in on several levels. We see it from our own perspective and make judgments about, like, who's right and who's wrong in any given situation. We also see it through Joel's perspective as we sort of watch him grow as a person through this experience, as his perception of these memories changes. And then, of course, there's this external element of seeing it through the text perspectives as well. Like, that obsession that Patrick develops with Clementine is based on these memories that he sees, and he's doing just what the viewer is. So he's seeing these events through both his own and through Joel's perspectives at the same time. I think it gets very trippy and very meta really fast.
Yeah, I'm having an existential crisis over here after all of that. Like, what is life? And my brain hurts. And I loved everything you said. Like, I'm all in on it, but I feel like I need a nap or something.
You need some time to process.
I need some time to process my own memories of that conversation. Anyway, so how do we create an unreliable narrator? So you create an unreliable narrator through filters and kind of selective showing. So every scene you write is already selective because you're picking moments that propel your reader through your story. But for an unreliable narrator, you need to pick moments that propel your reader through a specific viewpoint of your story. So you apply filters and judgments from your unreliable narrator. How do they see the world that is skewed from what is actually happening? How do their opinions and judgments and preconceptions alter their perspective? Do they have a history with someone that makes them view every act as malicious, maybe? Or do they assume that they are always in the right because they're coming from a very selfish, vain perspective and they're unable to see how they're harming other people? Do they have a selective memory where they only remember the stuff that supports their position? Things
I feel
like
like
that.
your tone is very pointed right now.
I was wondering if you'd pick up on that. I was thinking that as I was saying it, I'm like, Jenny's going to think this is about her.
That's my viewpoint. And based on my preconceptions.
Amazing. No, it's not about you, Jenny. I'm not being pointed.
I have no proof of that.
It's true. Basically, you need to decide what perspective you want your readers to have on your story and then feed them information that supports that perspective or viewpoint. But then kind of comes the hard part, which is you want to find information or perspectives that you've been withholding and use those perspectives to shed everything in a new light. So once you have those pieces that you know you're withholding from your reader, you need to start laying hints and small moments that cause your reader to begin questioning your narrator. So let's say in this movie, the first big moment that we begin to question what is going on, at least I think, is when Patrick shows up at Joel's car and knocks on the window and he asks what Joel is doing here. Mm-hmm. So from Joel's perspective, it's like, oh, maybe this is like some weird neighbor or something that's like overly protective or neighborhood watchy. But then it seems incongruous enough that it'll make your viewers kind of take notice. And then as they see more or like start to see hints of Patrick, they start to piece it together. So you kind of want to lay in all of those small moments. It's also kind of like our first hint that the relationship we've been seeing isn't necessarily the relationship from the memories, because there's kind of that gray area of like, is this their actual beginning or is this a new beginning, basically? Mm-hmm. So you want to give your readers these small moments that will slowly help them put the pieces together, that everything they're reading can be called into question. And then you either have that big reveal where we learn everything we have known is actually slightly different, or you can get the reader to understand slowly that the narrator just isn't trustworthy. Mm-hmm. I like to think of like Catcher in the Rye, where we all know Holden sees the world a very specific way and through his very specific eyes that is not necessarily falling in line with the truth or what's actually happening. Everything is very skewed. So either way, the goal is for the reader to understand that the story they've read is heavily skewed to the perspective of your narrator and that they haven't gotten the whole story. So it's kind of dividing it between what feeds into what you want them to believe and what you withhold from your reader to be revealed later.
Yeah, and I think, so we've talked on here before about sort of deciding, you know, I literally just totally lost my thought in the middle of saying it.
Come back to it.
Yeah, I'll come back to it. Oh my gosh, I hate when that happens.
I do too.
It's going to bother me so much.
Deciding what's important to show and tell your readers? Is that what you're thinking?
I honestly don't know.
Okay, let's move on.
Yeah, oh my gosh, that's going to bother me. Okay, let's move on. An unreliable narrator, as you said, they mislead the reader, intentionally or unintentionally. At least from their perspective, it's either intentional or unintentional. It should always be intentional on the author's part. As we've been discussing, that forces the reader or the viewer to draw their own conclusions as they realize they can't trust or believe everything the narrator shows. And then they have to figure things out for themselves. It's this really deep level of engagement. But it doesn't work for every story. I can imagine some listeners right now going like, well, I have been getting feedback that, you know, my story isn't engaging enough, so maybe I'll try an unreliable narrator. It doesn't necessarily work for every story. Imagine if every narrator were unreliable. Like, readers already have these trust issues. Like, we would never trust anything ever again. So, as with everything in writing, I'm going to encourage our listeners to really consider, what do you gain by using an unreliable narrator? Because essentially you are tricking the reader when you do this. So it has to have a payoff for them. The best stories with unreliable narrators are the ones where the author wants the reader to have this unstable relationship to the quote unquote truth of the story. It basically creates this multi-layered story with various levels of what that truth is, and invites the reader to consider maybe what truth actually is in life. It makes people have existential crises. So, like, breathe, Carly. It's going to be okay.
Okay, I'll try.
Mysteries use unreliable narrators a lot. Another episode of the podcast we did was about Knives Out. And that's a really fundamental part of that story. Like, there's a huge cast of characters, and each of these characters remembers things slightly differently. And the viewer isn't really sure how much of that is in their actual memory and how much is in their retelling of events to present themselves in a more positive light.
So what I'm hearing is this episode should have been about genre blending, and that episode should have been about unreliable narrators.
It's possible. It's possible.
Okay.
So basically, we just need to go back and redo the whole podcast, every episode.
Let's just start over from the beginning. Make better choices.
Perfect. Yep. I think that's a great plan. So I think it's really important to note that eventually the reader does need to know enough of the sort of objective truth to have a clear understanding of how the main plot and conflict gets resolved. So like I said before, in this movie, there are some things that we never really know for sure exactly how they happened, but we get a close enough approximation that we can draw conclusions and understand how those events affect the main plot and characters.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So, I've said this before on this podcast and everywhere, and I'm going to say it again because it's kind of one of my favorite way of looking at books, but every narrator is unreliable in some way because we as people are unreliable narrators. We come to every situation from our own perspective with our own baggage and our own preconceptions. So unless you have an omniscient narrator, and sometimes even then, your POV is going to be skewed by your narrator. Everyone perceives things differently based on their past. It's basically how I recommend authors find their character's voice. It's applying filters based on their past and their preconceptions that cause your characters to color situations differently. So if you have a past with someone and you don't like them, you're going to interpret them asking you something as benign as, how's it going, differently. Maybe you'll interpret it as snarky or pointed because they're obviously referring to your recent breakup or whatever. But maybe in truth, the other
missed opportunity there.
Yeah, right? But maybe in truth, the other character has no idea about the breakup and they're just genuinely asking. Maybe they're trying to bridge the gap between the two in their relationship. That's kind of what makes all characters unreliable narrators. Their perceptions are intrinsically unreliable. So, like Jenny said, when she was talking about like crime shows, like we all remember things very vastly differently, and it doesn't make them less true. It just means everything is colored by our perceptions. However, that being said, do not take this to mean that your narrator is definitely unreliable and you need to have an unreliable narrator. Because when we say someone's an unreliable narrator, typically we mean that they are to a greater degree than normal.
The term unreliable narrator is a little bit more specific.
It's a little more specific. So like an actual unreliable narrator colors scenes differently, but also holds a lot back from their reader. Often there's that big reveal that we talked about. But sometimes it is just knowing that the narrator is heavily skewed and opinionated, and that's good too. But in books, whether or not a narrator is unreliable kind of comes down to the degree to which their version of events is alters or differs from what actually happened. We as people are trained to kind of understand that everyone has their own perspective on things. It's kind of just empathy in general. We can relate to that. But while all narrators are all unreliable, they only get classified as such if they hide things from the reader or have that very, very heavily skewed perspective. So it's a good way to think about it, but don't let it alter necessarily what you're doing with your story. Don't think, oh, well, in this romance, they're both unreliable narrators and I'm going to have a big twist at the end. You don't have to do that, but it's a good tool to try to flesh out that voice, I would say.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think for me, when I'm trying to determine, is this enough to be classified as an unreliable narrator, I think it comes down to the impact it has on the story. Mm-hmm. So like, is the story really impacted itself by the fact that this narrator is withholding information from the reader?
That's a great point.
So I think that is one criteria that you can use to kind of figure that out. It made me think, though, I want to talk a little bit about how point of view and voice play a part in all of this, too. We've discussed the importance of those elements before, but they're really the building blocks of any narrator. They're often confused for one another, especially when it comes to deep point of view. But essentially, the voice reflects a character's personality, while the point of view reflects how they interpret the world because of that personality. Yeah. So point of view almost becomes like this lens, this filter that they apply over how they describe things because of the personality and how they see the world because of it. So they're intimately related, but they're not quite the same thing. And it's super important for any narrator. But when it comes to an unreliable narrator, it has a level that reliable narrators don't, because your reader learns at some point that they can't trust the narrator. It makes it that much more important for your narrator to be relatable, someone that the reader can engage with on a deep level. When you're writing an unreliable narrator, that's something you have to take into consideration. So just as you want to carefully control the information that this unreliable narrator gives, you also want to make sure that the reader understands why this narrator isn't straightforward. And you're going to see that both in their actions and reactions and in their voice and point of view. So in other words, we need to see it on a story level. Like, what do they do? How do they act? How do they react? But we also need to see it on this fundamental writing level in terms of getting across that personality and how that personality skews their view of the world. So that's super easy, right? No problem.
So easy. I will say that, like, Joel is relatable because, like you were kind of saying earlier on, we all get the want or the need to forget something and get rid of the hurt. But then seeing him kind of come to terms with, like, yeah, it hurt, but I still want these memories. I still cherish them is a really relatable thing, even though it's all very skewed.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. We also haven't yet discussed something that really struck me as really lovely, which is just the level of pettiness of, like, well, you got your memories removed, so I'm going to get my memories removed too. And that's so, like, just fabulous. And, like, I'm really here for that.
I know. I loved that pettiness. Although, so here is my only kind of problem with the lore of this, like, world.
Yeah.
If this, like, technology exists, how have none of the characters ever heard about it?
Yeah.
And then also, if you were to get a letter in the mail that says so-and-so has had so-and-so removed from their memory, never mentioned them, would you believe that? Because they seem to believe it. Yeah. Like, his friends believe it, but also had never heard of it before. They were just like, yeah, okay, that seems true.
I got the impression that it was fairly new.
Still, though.
But yeah. Yeah, I feel you on that.
I don't know. That was my only,
you just ruined the whole movie for me.
That was my only, like, little world-building plot hole that I was like, okay.
Yeah, I see that. Obviously, this is in an era where, in a world where people don't question corporate entities at all and just assume that they all have, like, everyone's best interests at heart.
Definitely.
That's the most unrealistic part. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. Let's buy in.
Okay, so this month our query is also a romantic genre mashup, even though that's not technically what we're talking about this month. Carly,
Not
what are your
salty.
thoughts about this query?
So it has a lot of good elements, but there's a lot going on in this query. I'm kind of missing a lot of that connective tissue. Like, and this is gonna sound pointed maybe, but I'm missing kind of the basics of the plot and the setting. I think this author got kind of caught up in like what elements are interesting or different about my story. And while those can be a great hook, I'm missing kind of the meat of the story here. So I'm not sure what the main character is trying to achieve and why she is in this situation to begin with. So I'd suggest practicing by like writing out a very, very simplified like opening plot. So who your main character is, why she's in this situation, what conflict she's going to come up against, and what is at stake. And then once you've done that in like very simple language, keep it as direct and clear and concise as possible. You can find ways to like insert the love interest and the magic system and the world building and all of those window dressings that make it eye-catching. But really start by focusing on the journey of your main character before adding in all of those catching elements and like verbiage. Is kind of what I was thinking with this one.
Yeah, no, I really agree. Like there are a lot of elements here. There's a lot of really cool sounding elements here.
Really cool ones.
Yeah, it makes me think you can probably pare back on some of those to focus more on the most fundamental elements, those fundamental aspects of the story that Carly was outlining. Like we've got an assassin, a dark mage, a necromancer, a moon patroness. I'm not sure what that means, but it sounds seriously cool. And I think maybe I might want to be one. Yeah, exactly.
Can we
we've
just
got beasts. We've got wars. Like it's a lot. It's a lot. And it's kind of hard to parse out what the plot really is, what the main character is trying to accomplish. Like all that stuff Carly was just saying, just because of having to try to hold it all in my mind kind of at the same time.
Mm-hmm. And Jenny's mind is a little sometimes busy.
Addled.
Yes.
So I'm getting some very, very cool dark fantasy vibes here, but I'd like to see it all streamlined some so that I can really feel hooked by those most important elements.
You don't want to addle Jenny's mind and give me an existential crisis. Like, it just... we both
Not
shut
that
down.
Either of those things. I feel like we're always, like, right on the cliff of those things anyways.
I know. It just
it doesn't take
like
much
tip over. No.
So, yeah. So, I think that, again, to sum up, the story seems like it has some really cool stuff in it.
It does.
But you just need to kind of pare it back a little. I do want to sort of add on to what Carly was saying about the simple language. Sometimes I'll tell people to write it like you're writing it for like a second grader initially. Mm-hmm. Like really, I mean, even sometimes, it's fine to say like, she did this, she did that. And then go back and make it sound pretty and fancy. Just make sure you've really got those fundamentals down before you worry about the hook part of it.
Yep, exactly. All right, so next month we will be watching another Guillermo del Toro film because we couldn't get enough of The Shape of Water. We'll be watching Pan's Labyrinth, which I am so excited for. This is another one.
Have you seen that one before?
I have, but it's been a very long time.
Same. And I think I might have a very different reaction to some of it this time.
I do too. Maybe I'll be more scared
about that.
Yeah, I don't know. Damn nightmares or something. I don't know. We'll see. Anyway, we will also have another query or blurb critique. So if you want your query featured on the podcast, you can find the details about how to do that on our website or Twitter page.
You can find our podcast on our website, storychatradio.com, or you can follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Play Music, or many other streaming services. While you're there, please leave us a rating. You can also support the show and get extra content at patreon.com/storychatradio. And you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at storychatradio.
Thanks for joining in our nonsense.